Welcome to America's Vote 2024 and our special coverage of Super Tuesday. Voters in 15 states and the American Samoa have been casting votes all day, and here's a quick look at the polls that are closing this hour. Vermont and Virginia, polls closing at 7 p.m. just seconds ago, and North Carolina expected to close within 30 minutes. The magic number to win the Republican nomination is 1,215 delegates, and for the Democrats, it's 1,968. Now, no one will reach that threshold tonight, but Donald Trump is clearly in the lead for the GOP nomination against Nikki Haley. She's hoping voters in Virginia send a clear message. Haley campaigned in Virginia earlier, hoping to cut into Donald Trump's formidable lead. We're going to get into all of that in just a few minutes. And I'm just hearing from the control room that Decision Desk HQ has, in fact, called Vermont and Virginia. They have called Vermont and Virginia for Joe Biden. Again, the Decision Desk HQ projecting Joe Biden wins the Vermont Democratic primary. That decision made right at 7 p.m. No surprise there. And Decision Desk HQ projecting that Joe Biden has also won the Virginia Democratic primary. Again, no surprise there. But let's bring in our team of all-star journalists. Julia Manchester, host of What's America's Thinking on The Hill TV, and Rafael Bernal, who appears frequently on What's America Thinking as well. And I'm really going to be interested to see Virginia's turnout for the Republicans, not the Democrats.
Yeah, no surprise that Joe Biden won in Virginia. But for Republicans, we're obviously watching a number of areas. Northern Virginia, where we see a lot of highly educated voters. Washington, D.C. adjacent voters. That would play well for Haley. The Richmond suburbs, same kind of deal. Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, a bit more of a toss-up. But for Donald Trump, he is going to really be working on running up the score in areas west of Charlottesville as you get into the Shenandoah Valley, that area. However, you know, a lot of these voters are Glenn Youngkin voters, and these Glenn Youngkin voters have also voted for Donald Trump.
Well, Rafael, I mean, immigration issue number one. I mean, we're seeing from the Decision Desk HQ exit polls that just started to come out, and we've got Scott Transer later on, that immigration is the top issue for voters.
The top issue, and it's mind-blowing how different that is for Republicans and Democrats. It's the top issue for 44% of Republicans.
Wow.
That is a huge issue. I don't think any issue historically really approaches it. Maybe the economy in 1992. For Democrats, it's 9%. Which is just another run-of-the-mill issue. And that's a huge difference. I think that happens because Donald Trump has been setting the agenda on immigration for nearly a decade now.
But is it just immigration? Is it just Donald Trump, or is it also that these cities are being completely impacted by the immigration issue? It's a national security issue as much as it is an economic issue. I mean, when you've got Eric Adams in New York City, for example, having to call for different policies, everyone's talking about immigration. But to your point, Donald Trump, from the prism of politics, was talking about it first.
He was talking about it first, and he framed it. He framed it as that national security issue, as a criminality issue, when we know, like, the numbers say that really criminality is brought down by immigrants. There is a lower crime rate among immigrants than among natural-born Americans, and this includes undocumented immigrants. And then you do have cities that are basically complaining because there's no organization. We are onboarding hundreds of thousands of people, but we're not doing it correctly.
Joining me now is Scott Transer with Decision Desk HQ. Scott, you've got some breaking data from the exit polls just coming in. Tell us, what are the numbers telling you about what issues voters are ranking as their top priorities?
So it's immigration, a little bit like we talked about earlier. Immigration for both the Democrats and Republicans is really carrying the day. And what's interesting, at least this time we're hearing it, this is from people who actually showed up to vote, and we're talking to them as they're finishing up voting. So this is about as pure as you're going to get as what voters are thinking as they go to the polls today.
So what role are Democrats, or what emphasis are Democrats placing in terms of how they're prioritizing abortion?
So it's also a big issue for them, which is what we kind of knew. And we knew this from elections last year, but we didn't know if this was going to carry over till this year. And the fact that we're seeing it in the primary tells me that they're going to be motivated come this fall. And that is a good issue for Joe Biden and the Democrats, because they may have some turnout issues, and they need an issue like that to get their voters to come out.
According to the Decision Desk HQ Super Tuesday exit poll, 27% of Democratic voters prioritizing abortion and citing it as their top issue. The economy ranked second at 25%, education ranking third at 11%. You know, you got to wonder whether that ruling in Alabama with regards to IVF had any impact in terms of how the Democrats are prioritizing these issues. We saw this after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
That's exactly right. You know, the Alabama issue really brought this to the forefront. We're seeing it motivated 1 in 4 Democrats. That's a big number, because not only are they coming to vote, but we see it in the fundraising rolls. We see it in the Democrats being able to fundraise, and they're going to be able to take this one to the fall, because there are a lot more issues, abortion-related issues on the ballot, not just at the presidential level.
Well, and beyond that, just digging deeper, one of the big storylines that we're following tonight is the impact of the Israel-Hamas war and this uncommitted vote that the far left has tried to organize in 7 states against President Biden, urging Democrats to vote uncommitted in some of these contests. But according to your exit poll, the Decision Desk HQ, it found that only 9% of Democrat voters cited foreign policy as their top issue. It came in 5th overall. Is that good news for President Biden?
It is good news, and it's funny. It actually lines up with roughly what the uncommitted vote got in Michigan, where they had their big push for that uncommitted role. And this largely lines up. Look, I'm not saying that there aren't Democrats out there who foreign affairs, and specifically Israel and Gaza, aren't their biggest issue. But as the chart you're showing up here, that's not what's motivating them to come to the polls. Nearly 2.5 to 1. Abortion is a bigger issue than, say, foreign affairs for Democrats.
And that ceiling, just to your point, to underscore that ceiling for the progressive movement for the uncommitted, still in single digits. A lot of Democrat strategists that I talk to want to keep it in single digits, because it really starts to get ugly in the battleground states for Democrats if it gets in to double digits. Some good news in your exit poll for former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. She performs better than former President Trump among self-identified independent voters and Democrat voters. But those independent voters, I mean, there's like 18 districts throughout the country and a handful of counties where these independent voters arguably decide the whole thing.
Exactly. And we had seen data like this in these early primaries, but this is the first hard data piece we've seen across all these Super Tuesday states that supports the theory that Donald Trump is going to have an issue getting independent voters. And in a race that's razor thin with Joe Biden, he's going to need to stay competitive, if not win that. And it's going to show us tonight, these exit polls show us that he's got a problem there. And it's not just 1 or 2 states. We now have a pretty big sample size, and I expect to see this as we go throughout the primary season.
So, Scott, as you're looking at these numbers and you look at Nikki Haley's supporters still backing her, and then you've got the 9% or so who are ranking foreign policy on the left as their top issue, who's impacted more, Trump or Biden, in terms of the unrest within their own respective parties about each of them?
That's a tough one. I would say it's independence and the problem Trump has, just because it's a much bigger number and certainly more volatile for him. But where I will say that the 9% for Joe Biden, it's hurting him in specific places where he's got razor thin margins, like Michigan, like Wisconsin, like Minnesota. And so those are the places. It's a smaller number, but you know, those are razor thin, and those smaller numbers still mean something to him.
Polls closing shortly in the Tar Heel state, North Carolina, and recent polls show Nikki Haley shrinking her deficit against Donald Trump by 28 points. What should we be watching in North Carolina when those polls close just minutes from now?
We should be looking to see how she's going to do in Mecklenburg County. That is just outside of Charlotte. It's full of the suburban, college-educated, independent voters we're talking about. If she's going to have a chance to overperform, I don't think she's going to win, but she's going to have a chance to overperform. That's where it's going to be. She's going to look at it there. And again, Mecklenburg is also a good proxy for all the other places that she might have to do well, or Joe Biden's going to have to do well if he's going to win this fall.
Scott, how much caffeine have you had tonight?
Oh man, I'm on my 100 ounce of cold caffeine. We're gonna double that up. I'm gonna take your advice though. Maybe I'll go get some of this Gatorade stuff.
You know, I do drink that before a workout, but maybe switch to water, Scott. I'm going to worry about you, my friend.
I gotta stay up for 24 hours. Get these numbers.
We need you counting the votes. My thanks to Scott Tranter over at the Decision Desk. Go back to counting votes, Scott, and give us the latest.
Thank you.
And a couple of big races that we're following in the battleground states of North Carolina, the Tar Heel state, and polls are closing in just a few minutes at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. We welcome back Chris Berg, who is the Vice President of Content for Nexstar's affiliate stations. We love to flex that Nexstar muscle, more than 200 stations. Chris, what's going on with the governor's race in North Carolina?
Well, right now, I just talked to our station in Raleigh, and it's pretty quiet at the polls. Not surprising, turnout hasn't been huge across the state. So they're just saying it's slow right now, and polling is polls about to be closed here in about 20 minutes. So there's not a mad rush to get to the precincts in Raleigh. You know, as we talked about earlier, Mark Robinson is likely to win the Republican nomination, and Josh Stein, the Attorney General, likely to win the Democratic nomination. You know, people on the Mark Robinson side, you know, some conservatives are worried about him being electable. He's an outspoken, very conservative person who arrived on the scene about 2018. A speech he did in front of a city council went viral, and a couple years later, he was the lieutenant governor of North Carolina. Right now, those two in a poll are in a dead heat. If you extrapolate everything out, so Josh Stein and Mark Robinson, if it holds true, will be the two folks that will be running against one another in November. You know, Josh Stein is got a money advantage right now. That could change. We're not sure, you know, where Mark Robinson is going to get his cash at the moment. But as a Republican nominee and a shot to win, it's a 41-41 poll right now. With those two, so he will have some support. Again, polls close at 7:30, as you mentioned. But that's not the only dynamic that's going on in North Carolina.
And I want to get more into North Carolina, but we're getting some early results coming from Virginia's presidential Republican primary with just about 1% of the vote in. Trump up 75.5%, Nikki Haley at 21.9%, Chris Christie at 1.5%. So again, way too early, but with 1% of the vote in the Virginia presidential Republican primary, Trump leading according to the early votes that are being cast there. Now, sticking with North Carolina, there's some other districts, but I want you to frame this, Chris, through the prism of why everybody else outside of those districts should care and what this could tell us about the inter-party fighting that's going on in these congressional districts.
There is a lot of inter-party fighting, and no congressional district is more magnifying that issue than District 1, where Sandy Smith ran a couple of years ago against Don Davis, Democrat, lost 52-48. She's running again this year. She's a supporter of Donald Trump. But Colonel Lori Buckle, who is in District 1, which is near Greenville, northeast of Raleigh, is the Congressional Leadership Fund's favorite, and they gave her money. So you're looking at the top Republicans in the House are giving Lori Buckle the money, and not Sandy Smith, who does support Donald Trump and came close to beating Don Davis back in District 1. So very interesting dynamic there. And then when you get to District 6, which is closer to Greensboro, you've got Mark Walker, who was a former congressman, ran for Senate, is running in that race. Bo Hines, who ran in District 13 2 years ago, is running. But the choice of Donald Trump is a newcomer, Addison Mitchell.
And Chris, we have breaking news, and the breaking news from the Decision Desk HQ calling Virginia for Trump. Again, breaking news, Virginia, the Republican presidential primary, has been called for former President Donald Trump, a blow to Nikki Haley's campaign. She had been hoping to pull off an upset in this crucial battleground state, but just 13 minutes past the hour, the state of Virginia has been called for former President Donald Trump in the Republican primary. I want to bring back into this conversation. Chris, stay with us. Julie in Manchester, you've been on the campaign trail with Nikki Haley this week. It's now called for Trump.
It's now called for Trump. And ironically, I was with her in Northern Virginia last week, and I asked a number of her supporters, who do you think is going to win Virginia? Trump. They did not think this was winnable for Nikki Haley. The reason why a lot of her supporters coming out in Northern Virginia, and in some cases in the suburbs of Richmond, other parts of the state, they are arguing that in case something legally were to happen to Trump or any unforeseen circumstances, Nikki Haley will be waiting in the wings. So this is no surprise here. I think her campaign, her supporters were kind of hanging on to this glimmer of hope that more of the college-educated part of the population in Virginia, whether it's in Richmond, Northern Virginia, would help propel her. But like I said, Donald Trump is able to run up those margins with those Glenn Youngkin voters.
It's going to be interesting to see just what the final margin is, but it's still no upset. But Rafael Bernal, I mean, when you look at the Decision Desk HQ exit polls, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley continuing to perform better than former President Trump among self-identified independent and Democratic voters. So huge win for Trump in terms of just being able to maintain the status quo in his path to the nomination. But, you know, that margin of his victory in the battleground state is also going to matter.
It does matter, but I think Trump's issue would have been if he didn't win any state. He did lose D.C., and I think that sort of tracks with Northern Virginia. It's a reflection of D.C. Some in Virginia would hope that, you know, we would take it over into the D.C. side, but I think we're going to see what we're seeing is we're going to see the same trends over and over and over again. Very specific geographic areas around the country, giving Nikki Haley some credibility for the future, and doing as expected. The majority of Republicans, the broad majority of Republicans, are going to continue to vote for Donald Trump.
Let's bring in Chris Berg back into the conversation with regards to your analysis in terms of Virginia. Wow.
I got to be honest with you, Kevin, I haven't done a lot of research in Virginia because I've been focusing on these other states. So I'm going to leave it to the experts on that one.
Well, again, if you're just joining us, the Decision Desk HQ projecting that Donald Trump has won the Virginia Republican primary. That decision made 12 minutes past the hour. I will correct myself. I said 13, but I guess Scott Tranter and his colleagues are working 60 seconds overtime. You know, if you are Nikki Haley and you've lost Virginia, you've got to, the calculation then becomes, why are you still in this race? What are you going to do to hold on to this race? And it's still early in the night, but does she endorse Trump? Does she not endorse Trump? Does she join former Senator Larry Hogan, a Republican who's running for governor now, or I'm sorry, running for senator now in the state of Maryland, and people like Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins of Alaska and Maine, respectively, who are Republicans, who have said they're never going to vote for Trump. They haven't said who they're going to vote for. Former President George W. Bush picked up the phone and called Hogan and urged him to run for the Senate seat. And you've got McConnell leaving. And I mention all of that in the background because Nikki Haley would arguably like to make the case that she is now the leader of that Republican movement. But there are other Republicans who, you know, Liz Cheney, for example, who also would argue that they have a leadership role in that coalition.
Well, at least for Nikki Haley, she can go into that coalition. You know, there's been this chatter, you know, will Nikki Haley run third party? Will she stay in the Republican Party? At least there is a coalition, a place for her with Larry Hogan, Liz Cheney, maybe Mitch McConnell. I mean, he's not coming back as leader, but we'll see what he says going forward. There's a place for her to go if she decides not to endorse Trump. Because, you know, everyone's asking, will Haley endorse Trump? My question is, if she endorses him, does Trump accept her back into the fold? Because we know it's something that the former president values. It's loyalty.
Well, I want to head back to our expert on North Carolina because, Chris Berg, no one knows North Carolina politics better than you. And when you have a battleground state like North Carolina and you've got the suburbs in North Carolina, Nikki Haley arguably could help turn out some of those more moderate independent voters. So how crucial or what information do you think we'll be able to glean from the down ballot races and the primaries that are happening there tonight just about the impact of North Carolina in a general election, Chris?
Well, Donald Trump is either have supporters or endorsements and specific candidates through each of these congressional districts. And clearly, if you see people flocking towards those specific candidates, that would be a pretty good indication that Donald Trump will have a good night in North Carolina via Nikki Haley. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking for. In District 6, I was mentioning earlier, where Addison McDowell is a kind of a newcomer coming out of nowhere, received Trump's endorsement over Mark Walker, over Bo Hines. That's one of those things. You look at that District 6, you look at Addison McDowell. If this newcomer catapults to the win, that's a pretty good thought that Donald Trump is going to do well in North Carolina tonight.
Do you have any polling on North Carolinians wanting Duke or UNC in this weekend's basketball game, Chris?
I am not going to wade in that one.
Come on.
I do not have any polling.
Come on. I'm going to say I'm going to go with
middle
the
of the road, man.
Listen, if I can't have an opinion on sports, then what are we doing this for? Chris Berg, everybody, he is the vice president of local content for Nexstar. More than 200 stations to keep track of. Thank you, Chris, so much. I know you're really busy tonight, so thank you so much for making time for us. Appreciate it. Julie Manchester's with me, Rafael Bernal. Rafael, I mean, you see some of the battlegrounds and these down ballot races. There's a lot at stake tonight, but perhaps, a lot of folks have told me this is not like a Super Tuesday that we've had in the past. There doesn't seem to be much information, but it's almost like these other variables of will the likely standard bearers of each party be able to keep their coalition together. I mean, you and I have gone back and forth on this in the newsroom. I'm not sure they can.
I'm not sure they can either. For President Biden, it's especially hard. There's a lot of Democrats that are scared about his age. Frankly, there's a lot of talk. The more we talk about it, the more that is a reality in voters' minds, and it doesn't matter the reality of whether he can or cannot do the job. We can't know that, and it doesn't matter. What matters is the perception, and that is a real problem for Biden.
No, absolutely. It's a real problem, especially, when it comes to his age. We often see Trump and Biden compared when it comes to their age. We know that Trump is only a few years younger than Biden, and you hear rumblings about what Trump is like behind closed doors and private. But the fact of the matter is, when voters look at these two men side by side, they perceive Biden as being older and Trump as being more energetic. Now, not saying that voters don't look at Trump and say there's liability when it comes to his legal issues, but that
was settled. The Supreme Court settled. I mean, for the biggest question mark with regards to the ballot of whether or not he could be on the ballot in Colorado is settled by the Supreme Court.
It was already settled, but I think there still are questions about some of his other cases and how they play into this.
Well, and these Decision Desk HQ exit polls, if you're just joining us, the Decision Desk HQ releasing the first round of an exit poll that was conducted for all of the Super Tuesday nominating contests. And this interesting polling question about foreign policy, despite significant pundit class anticipation of progressive voters' responses to President Biden's stance on Israel's war against Hamas terrorist group, only 9% of Democratic voters cited foreign policy as their top issue. They ranked it 5th overall. So, Rafael, in terms of this uncommitted vote that has been going on, that the far left, Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, has been trying to mobilize in 7 states or something. If Democrats can keep this in single digits, that's good news for the Democrats. I mean, that's what Scott Traynor said. But if it gets into double digits, that's where you have some battleground headaches.
Well, if it gets battleground headaches. If it gets into double digits in Michigan, it's a problem. If it gets into double digits in California, honestly, it's not going to change much. And that's really the problem that Biden has to confront, especially because campaigns aren't primed to campaign on a foreign policy issue, because foreign policy is not a sticky issue with voters historically. It's really hard to campaign on foreign policy, same way that the Biden campaign is having trouble campaigning on immigration. That hasn't traditionally been that sticky. But I think, after a decade of Trump, they're probably used to that one by now.
I think we have to be careful when we talk about the progressive vote and talking about the Democratic coalition, because I would say, maybe in this exit polling, progressives in general, it's not a big issue for them. But when you look at the Arab American vote, the Muslim American vote in Michigan, if they decide to sit this one out in November and they don't show up, that's going to be bad news for Biden.
But likely for the Jewish vote.
Yeah, no, it goes both ways. Absolutely. And I would argue that the road to the House majority runs through majority Jewish districts in California and New York. So, I thought it was interesting on Sunday when you heard Kamala Harris call for a ceasefire, very much trying to strategize to maybe appeal to that more progressive base, maybe to the Arab, the Muslim Americans. But my question is, as we look ahead to the State of the Union, how does Biden walk that fine line with those two very important constituencies?
I read that as a foreshadowing of the State of the Union, of a moment clearly that Biden's going to have to say. I thought it was interesting that the White House also saying Hamas doesn't want a ceasefire.
Right.
The terrorist group Hamas doesn't want the ceasefire. And I also thought it was interesting, and it did receive some criticism from Jewish Americans, that the vice president chose to make that remark on Bloody Sunday. It's an event commemorating Bloody Sunday in terms of that parallel, because of the deep history that the Jewish and Black Americans have had for decades. And so it was an interesting moment for her to make that comment. But there's another thing happening on the right, Julia Manchester, and you've been reporting on this, which is there is a shift happening right now, even more so potentially in the aftermath of 2016, with Trump remaking the leadership of the Republican Party. Yeah. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell announcing that he will not be the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, ending a decades-long grip of power here inside of the Beltway. You've got a host of different names jockeying for positioning, but the exit polls suggest that Trump is favored by 76% of voters who do not have a bachelor's degree, and 57% of voters who do have a bachelor's degree. Now, again, I am the first one to say that having a bachelor's degree or not doesn't mean you're smart or not, because quite frankly, well, that's a whole other show. It is.
Yeah.
But this breakdown might say something just in terms of the dynamics of the Republican Party and the fight for power.
Absolutely. And I think part of this is reflected in that the Republican Party has been dominated by populism. You're seeing it on the left too, but you are seeing a lot of these voters who, ever since 2016, these voters that might not have a college degree, that are from blue-collar communities in states like Ohio,
Pennsylvania, where I grew up,
yeah, exactly. I know it sounds cliche to be talking about the Rust Belt, but it's true. It's true.
Look at John Fetterman, and he's a Democrat.
Yeah, these are people who feel that they've been left behind, that they feel the Democratic Party has turned their backs on them. And Donald Trump, a millionaire from New York City, flies in and is able to appeal to them.
Well, and the breaking news tonight, before coming on air, Senator Kirsten Sinema, Raphael, who's a lifelong Democrat, switches it up to be an independent, now says she's not going to run. Do you think immigration had anything to do with that?
I think it had absolutely everything to do with that. She led this Senate bipartisan deal. That was her thing.
And it failed.
And it failed. That was what she was going to take to the voters of Arizona. She's empty-handed now. There's also a bunch of technical campaign issues. She was very late to start her campaign. It was going to be very expensive for her, just difficult in general for her if she did decide to run. But what was she going to run on?
Well, what was she going to run on?
It's a good question. I mean, look, she was in the Senate. She was a disruptor in many ways of how Joe Manchin was the disruptor, sometimes going against her own party and, working with Republicans, ticking off that progressive base, even though Republicans will point out she did, vote with Biden much of the time. But that she wasn't appealing to the base like Carrie Lake was appealing to her base, and like Ruben Gallego to his.
So just in the couple of minutes that we have left, I mean, just one of the biggest questions of the night has already been answered. Virginia went for former President Donald Trump against Nikki Haley. Now we head into Texas, where there's some down ballot jockeying going on. Polls close there at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then at the 9 o'clock Eastern hour, we've got Colorado. Colorado, and Minnesota. And then, of course, California, where you've got that fight for the, I guess, Democrat, but it's a jungle primary, so a Republican technically could go to the late for Senator Dianne Feinstein's seat, jockeying for that. So, you know, some other things to watch for just in terms of just how many Democrats vote uncommitted in those battleground states, to Raphael's point. But again, one of the big questions has been answered tonight. Nikki Haley will not win Virginia in the Republican primary. Final words for you, Raphael, and then Julia.
I'm also looking at the Texas Senate Democratic primary, where if a runoff happens, it'll happen later this month, and that might get interesting.
Yeah, well.
So on the Texas Senate Democratic primary, pro-Ted Cruz super PAC gave us the first look at a video they have attacking Colin Allred. The Cruz allies, the Cruz world, they're already gearing up to go up against Colin Allred. Democrats seem to think that they have some sort of a chance in Texas, maybe Florida. We'll see.
It's like, you know, Texas politics always gets interesting.
Yeah.
Raphael Bernal, Julia Manchester, my two friends and colleagues here at the Hill. Super Tuesday, this is what we live for.
It's super.
Every Tuesday's super.
I mean, but this super.
It's this
okay,
super.
So that's it for this hour. Come back, stay with us all night. You have been watching America's Vote 2024 on a super Tuesday, to quote Julia Manchester. We will have continuing coverage right here at 9 p.m. Eastern.